So I got the thumbs up to begin this super informal chat. So for anybody who doesn't know, I'm stoked to have everybody here. Obviously, we don't do these type of like webinars where all three founders jump on something if it wasn't important. But this last kind of month and a half has been a real doozy for all of us. So for those that don't know you, I'm Kyle Hansloven. I'm the CEO and a co-founder of Huntress. But I've also got my chief architect, Chris Bisnett here. And I've got John, another co-founder that runs our threat operations team. That's the team that actually, anytime like our algorithms need augmentation, that's the team that's doing reverse engineering, all that stuff. So all three of us, by the way, is former NSA folks. For those that are just joining us, never seen us. So our whole career was kind of offensive security, gathering intelligence. And this whole situation started with just working with some of our partners. This is not going to be a sales pitch. It's not going to have a call to action other than come hang out with us. We're really just trying to educate. And one of the things that's really kind of made us salty over the last probably 6 weeks is there needs to be a little bit more threat intel sharing in the MSP channel. That's both with MSP partners. That's definitely with vendors. And so this is our introduction to how to share threat intel efficiently. And then maybe it works as a call to action for the greater community. So with that said, I'm going to do a handful of screen sharing. I don't know if anybody saw any of the social media posts, but we've actually worked with enough partners that we have some redacted videos. So we even have like live screen connect videos of the attackers doing some of these recent incidents. So without further ado, I'm going to screen share real quick. I'm going to set a real tone, but you'll notice this is going to be very ad hoc. We're going to do a quick brief overview, but really get into some of the how can we protect, defend, respond type scenario as well.
Yeah, well, Kyle's getting that set up. Some of the videos we're going to show you today, like Kyle said, were recordings from one of our customers' Screen Connect. So they had it set up so that anytime somebody would log in and do a Screen Connect, they'd capture a video of that and store it off. For us, this was pretty interesting because a lot of times we see the after effects of the incident where something has happened, and we dig through the logs to kind of work backwards and figure out what happened. In this case, we actually got video and we could watch the attackers do it live. So for us, that was kind of really interesting to see. And you'll see as well, they were very efficient, very fast. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had planned for this. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. So definitely give it a look.
So in true informal fashion, I've just got the screen sharing stuff up like that. Just so I don't go halfway through this demonstration thinking you all can see my screen. Everybody good to go? Just can I get a thumbs up or just somebody in chat to message me? Sweet, I saw raised hands, huge thanks. So real quick before we get into some of the formal side of it, I really want to cover a breach timeline, right? Typically when we're looking at incidents in our house at Huntress, we see a lot of like get initial access in seconds or minutes, and then we see kind of the exfiltration move throughout weeks and months. But what's really unique about this scenario that we're seeing, especially over the last month and a half, has been these attackers are almost primarily focused on extortion of money, right? It's not us saying that it's just cyber criminals, but it takes the typical breach timeline and kind of throws it on its head a little bit. And Chris already mentioned, these incidents happen super fast. These actors know our tools, I would argue, better than most MSPs and definitely better than us at Huntress. So I just wanted to kind of frame that even though this is the typical timeline where you'd have an incident that goes undetected, this incident real quick escalates. So just as a brief overview, right, I say we're going to discuss. Discuss is open-ended, right? This is not a listen to a vendor preach. This is ask Q&A. We're going to do our best job to give some great like step-by-step, this is how we think. You should be, better detecting, better responding, what you can do on prevention. We're going to try to not just say, run two-factor. I know everybody knows the two-factor for a lot of this incident, but the Q&A and upvoting is going to play a real important part here, hence the reason it's so ad hoc.
Yeah. There's actually Q&A functionality. So if you use the Q&A, like Kyle said, you can put in your question, other people can upvote it. That'll be a little bit easier for us to track rather than trying to like write stuff down as fast as we can as it scrolls through chat. So check out the Q&A functionality.
Okay, so I started this with case 0 being Screen Connect. That's definitely not a dig on anybody that's running Screen Connect, or I think it's called Control nowadays. The reason that it got brought up, it was the first case that we started probably about a month and a half, almost 2 months ago. We got involved in some of the attackers that targeted some of the larger foreign MSPs like WePro. And in that case, attackers got in through other mechanisms. There was no vulnerability in anything like Screen Connect. but they use Screen Connect to enable their access. And what all these incidents that we've seen, and just to kind of clear the air, there's been a lot of folks that immediately said, hey, I believe that, you know, this is one MSP that's managing multiple other MSPs. We wanted to kind of clarify that there are dozens at this point of independent, unrelated MSPs all being attacked by the same threat actor. It's not just one. And that was one of those things that we noticed there was a lot of like miscommunication and need for clarification on. So even in this one, we're not saying these are the same attackers for WePro, but what was interesting is in the WePro incident, the attackers used, and this is an actual copy of the configuration file that they were using for Screen Connect. And the whole idea behind this was to hide any visible user notifications that they might have actually seen, which is a cool way to segue. This actually has very little to do with WePro whatsoever.
Right. But
maybe the best way to show this is to start before actually seeing videos. Let's walk you through what we were actually seeing a little bit step by step of one of these recorded videos. So
if you're not familiar with Screen Connect, when you actually connect to the machine, when you remote into the machine, by default, the user will see a little bubble at the top of their screen that says, hey, so-and-so is now controlling your computer. Screen Connect allows you, or Control allows you to disable those. And that's what we're showing here, is that the attackers specifically went in to disable this so that the user would not know when someone was controlling their machine.
So without further ado, I'm going to huge thanks to our MSP partner that shared some of these redacted slides and screens with us. And the best way that we found to show this is through a story, right? So these are actual still images. We'll play some of the videos later. But what's neat about this is a great case of the same attackers. Like if you maybe came in here because you saw the Reddit posts about Webroot and Kaseya, we're absolutely going to be talking about that later. But what we want to show you is the actual tradecraft. So what better way to start than when we found one of the clients that was compromised? If you notice right away, this is what the attackers saw when they logged in with Screen Connect or Control. So you can see up at the very top, this was not hidden, right? Your computer's being controlled, and it was using an MSP account here, right? So it wasn't a new account, it was actually abusing credentials. And in this case here, we see like, do you want to allow this to run? In case anybody can see that there, it's Sage, right? This is a hot accounting software, and notice the attackers actually click no, and right away there's an error that says unable to log in with QuickBooks, which is super interesting, right? For an attacker who we just started out saying, hey, they're going after finance and data, they almost right away skip the accounting software. Without further ado, we see this case where they've actually used Screen Connect's run file and the ability to upload with the Screen Connect software, and we see this actual case. It's called start1488.exe, right? So they upload that copy of it using Control, and this was GanCrab. What's interesting about this actual attack is if you notice the timestamps in the bottom right-hand corner, this is almost a whole month ago, right? It's actually over a month ago. It's a month and a couple days. This is we actually saw, and GanCrab was still available. For those that don't know, the GanCrab ransomware authors actually they've announced they're going on retirement. So what we've actually noticed between these incidents, the attackers have actually switched what ransomware they're going to use because of actual changes in the economics of hackers. So, they go and drop the GanCrab installer. And notice, even a map shared drive on this accounting computer. And what's slick is this machine had Webroot running on it, and right away Webroot said, oops, we detected some threats as soon as they actually clicked on the file. So if we were watching the video version of this, this is the on-access scanner feature of most antivirus, when it says, I'm going to do constant scans like throughout the day on whatever schedule, but also on access, or when a file is created, I'm going to find this. So right, Webroot still detects this thing right away. And you notice Webroot blows the ransomware right away. So obviously things are looking good. In the bottom right-hand corner, you might not even realize, but the actual attacker went, and before this incident even kicked off, and we only learned this later, back in, late March, the attackers had already logged into this MSP's Webroot management console. And using that Webroot management console, they updated the policy to be able, so users could disable Webroot. So if you actually notice that this attacker goes and clicks the icon here, in case you can't see it, this is the big flashing red arrow here, to be able to refresh the Webroot policy, and they actually open the console. And we know where this goes, right? They open the console, right away they start clicking on some of the software like, do I want to disable? And because that policy, normally the user wouldn't have the ability to disable their antivirus. But the attackers were smart enough, they knew how the actual web root management console worked, and pushed a new policy that as long as you refreshed and got the new policy, you were able to go in, fill a CAPTCHA, and notice right away they'd gone and disabled this real-time shield, web shield in the firewall. So we know where this is going real quick, right? The next thing they do is they go into the Windows Defender console, once again using the tray icon. They go and actually make sure that, if you can see here, the Windows Defender antivirus, because WebRoot is running, they don't need to go and disable Windows Defender because it's actually disabled by default. So if you think about how this just worked, right, on demand, WebRoot is effectively enabled, but they've shut off the detection capability, which doesn't cause Windows Defender to enable again.
Right, right. Windows Defender disables itself when other antivirus products are installed, but it does not know the difference between when it's installed and when it's enabled or disabled. So as long as it's installed, Windows Defender here will show as not running.
Yeah, and this is actually something, John, on our threat ops team, when they're doing some of the research or even reporting, sometimes we actually report and we say this is the antivirus that was present, but we don't necessarily know if this was the antivirus that was running, right? So this is a legit issue when it comes to telemetry. Like, you might even have monitoring agents that say, is my antivirus running? But really no idea if it's enabled or disabled. So that's another interesting, hard problem to solve. So, right, they go in, now that WebRoot is disabled and Windows Defender is not even turned on, we see where this is going, right? They've gone and actually kicked off, they've pushed the new start 1488, and they go to run it. And this attacker's MO is they typically go, instead of actually looking to see if every file encrypts, they open up the task manager right away. You can actually see a couple things here. Not only is start 1488 running, but also you see that, like, on the disk IO, 90% IO is going on. That's it, just encrypting every single file, walking the file system as it goes. And that's effectively how the hacker ends this, right? In this case, they actually do browse to a screen, and you can see the manual ransomware notice from GanCrab here, which was a telltale sign, right? Unique ID -manual.txt as that indicator. But they quickly verify, that not only is ransomware running, it drops it, and that's it, right? So that's the MO here of these attackers. And before we pivot, I think it's a real cool case that we could actually show that, what does this look like in real time? So I've got, for instance, another video, and this is going to be super fast, super quick. So if we need to, we can watch it twice. So notice this is a computer. They get in, they drop that 1488, they verify manual is created, and that's it, right? We'll watch one more time. They get in, this is some multi-function printer. They install the, upload the ransomware control, run the actual file, make sure it encrypts, and they're done. And they move on to the next one. So it's almost augmented, right? They use automation to get in, maybe. They might use some automation to be able to push these files. But there's still, it's kind of like the Mechanical Turk of hackers, right? Mechanical Turk's a service that Amazon offers that allows humans to do quick things. These are probably a group of operators that are one after another, one computer, upload file, and maybe they actually do it. Maybe John is the one uploading files, and I'm the one managing the actual GUI to say, like, all right, double click. And maybe Chris is the operator giving them, like, advice saying, oh, this is how to disable WebRoot. This is how to enable access. So there's really a lot that goes to this.
Do we have a screenshot of the one where they were actually pulling down the file from the website? Because they evolved. Initially, they were downloading the file manually through Chrome.
Yeah, hook me up on Slack, John, if you can find one, and we'll actually share. But what's neat about this is a lot of these attackers, that was kind of the MO, one after another after another. And later in the actual demonstration, just to keep this exciting, we gathered a whole bunch of screenshots. And it's not just, for instance, WebRoot. Kind of every single product under the sun when it comes to security, including even Huntress in there, was in some of the actual task lists. So this isn't like a let the security vendor bash other security vendors, right? I'll actually show later on some of the actual demonstrations and some of the screenshots of, look, here is even our own product running as these hackers like run afoul of the actual network. Maybe the better way to get this kicked off is we kind of see a little bit more of what's going on. This might be a really good time for us to kick off maybe one of the craziest videos that I think we saw here, just to kind of give a heads up of what this looks like. So I'm going to walk through this web root console. We'll go from there, and then we'll kind of keep showing how this attacker was using between the videos. So for instance, those that are familiar with the web root, I think we all saw these, right? The media kind of went a little bit crazy and said, hey, we want to educate and get the word out as much as possible, which we obviously appreciate. Anytime that media partners are warning, like, look, this ransomware gang, right? We don't know if they're nation state. We don't know if they're overly sexy, right? We do know they're efficient. It appears that they're pretty darn good at getting credentials for MSPs. And we don't really know at this point, right? As you see some of these headlines, they're all quick to say, look, you know, hackers have actually managed to leverage MSP software to gain access. And it's real quick to say may have gained access into a web root console. I think one of the things that we wanted to clarify here was, so far, we've seen actual no proof in this case of any actual MSP product being compromised. We haven't seen any vulnerabilities for Kaseya. I know that was one of the headlines that kind of got blew out of proportion, right? We have seen vulnerabilities on products like RMMs, but this time we haven't seen any vulnerabilities in Kaseya. We haven't seen any vulnerabilities in WebRoot. However, as like a group of security researchers who did offense for a living, we're all kind of taking a step back and saying, like, how are these MSPs gathering so many credentials?
Yeah.
Right, John, what's one of your hypotheses, right? I know I put you on the spot since this is a live webinar. This is the way we roll.
I don't know. Data dump, maybe. Password reuse.
Yeah, that's one we've actually been milling over. Like, there's, you know, this is clearly if all the MSPs were compromised or like all WebRoot was compromised. You imagine these attackers we'd see, instead of 100 upvotes on Reddit or 100 people reporting to our support board saying, hey, we see an issue, we'd see much more like maybe thousands or tens of thousands considering how large those vendors are. So we don't believe that they have access to all credentials, but maybe it's some MSP product that was compromised, maybe something not related to security at all, right? And I'm definitely not going to throw anybody under the bus. We haven't seen anybody, but what if there was a dump? Right? Maybe it's nothing more than somebody signed up for an MSP trade show and the same passwords and emails that were used for that MSP trade show were used for like logging in and password reusing to Screen Connect. We've talked to the actual Kaseya team and they've confirmed to us that all of their logs and all the VSA instances they've seen, they're only seeing password logons. They're also not seeing brute force, which indicates that these hackers actually have credentials somehow. I mean, we suppose that they could have got one MSP after another, right? Just got really lucky and keystroke logged. However, like we have several of our own customers, you know, we're a breach detection and response service. So we're there to tell you, hey, you had an incident, but unfortunately the damage is largely done. If you imagine by the time we're saying, hey, one or two of these computers is ransomed, real quickly does it become 10, 20, 30, you know, or several hundred in cases we've seen. So we even internally haven't seen like keystroke monitoring software, which is a little bit, you know, sad for us to be a point for us to come back as a vendor. That's part of this webinar is to say, hey, look, we can't do this on our own. We've got a lot of great threat intel. We've got hundreds of MSP partners that have, you know, that we work with. In this case, probably about 20 MSP partners total we've worked with in this like month and a half time period for these incidents. We've even talked to the IT by Design team who is pretty forthcoming and saying like, look, we had an incident, we quickly cleaned it up, we're trying to handle this, right? But as you can see, several hundred people have actually chimed in. Unfortunately on our end, I think we're one of the few that have actually showed the threat intel. I think we also saw a cool plug from the team at UBX Cloud were the ones that brought this up. But we really kind of part of this push is please, right? DHS back in February of this year, they did a whole thing on the Cloud Hopper APT, which the actual US government said, look, APTs are coming after MSPs and they have been for the last couple of years. We don't know if this is necessarily nation state, but these are definitely persistent attackers, right? They're definitely coming in.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, if you're looking at it, do I want to spend a bunch of time to get into one company, or do I want to spend that same amount of time to get into an MSP who then I can use all of their existing tools and infrastructure to get into, you know, hundreds of companies? Attackers are looking for ways to scale up their activities because what they're doing is based on, you know, economies of scale. They want to get as many companies as possible, ransomware as many machines as possible. That gives them the best chance to succeed with what they're looking to do. So MSPs who have access to a lot of different companies, you're gonna start to get targeted because it just makes it real easy to get what you're looking for.
Yeah, so I think this is probably a good time to actually share some of these, what ifs, right? It's so easy to say, oh, so-and-so got disabled, so-and-so vendor did a bad job. I get it. We read the Reddit posts. We see the vendors that get beat up either way. We kind of wanted to, shine some light on this case to actually, bring it up. So if you give me 1 second, I'm going to go back to screen sharing real quick now that I've got some of these slides ripping and ready to go, or some of these pictures. So one of my favorite, and this is the one John mentioned earlier, keep in mind, this is off of somebody's actual Screen Connect, so the quality is not always great. But notice that even some of the defense in depth, like the browser here, this was the attackers who had got in through control still, so we're still talking about control, and they had actually got in and tried to use the browser to download this malicious malware. What's funny about this, I guess it's kind of a malicious malware. All malware is malicious, for heaven's sakes.
Yep.
But this is one of those cases that we're seeing. This was an actual company in Brazil. They were compromised, and they're using and hosting the ransomware at this time off their own domain. But thankfully, Chrome browser said, hey, we ran this against our virus total. We ran this against our essential panel and said, hey, you know what? We're going to stop you from downloading this, right? That's a cool example of that layered security that most people don't even think that your browser selection makes a difference, right? If your browser is determining reputation of files and preventing users, it even prevents people when they compromise your session, right? I have no excuse for this one. This is security essentials, right? There's a lot of AVs that are great. Windows Defender is a good example of one that's becoming much better. But this is a good example of even when it comes to security essentials. The actual attackers coming in, disabling security essentials. That's good to know. We notice, right, security essentials isn't the only one. Here's a case where they actually said, you know what, instead of disabling your antivirus, why don't I go and just create an exclusion, right? Everything, I don't know if you all see that, everything on $. And then we didn't just see this, right, on Malwarebytes, right, John? There was others too?
Mm-hmm.
What was the other one that was the exclusion? Was that maybe Defender?
It was either Defender or maybe Norton.
Yeah, something along those lines. So, and I mentioned that, hey, we were going to call it out, right? Here, flat out, this is the case of disabling the actual security products. Let me see if I can have, here's straight up. Here's an instance of this actual case here where Huntress is running in the task manager. You can actually see the Screen Connect client, and there's Huntress, right? So we're just as guilty in this case of whether you can be defended, whether you can get slipped by, right? Our whole job is detection and response, and we're internally taking this as how can we be better? This is kind of what we want to, bring to attention here. What I want to do though is go back. I think this is a great case that before we fully pivot to WebRoot to show what this looks like. So here's my favorite, video. All these videos are going to be shared. We're going to record this session for anybody. So here's another one of these fancy videos. Notice that they're in a restaurant point of sale machine. You can then see in the bottom right hand or bottom left hand corner, it says this is the bar computer. And notice you have all the stuff, employees who check in and out, gift cards, sales. This is the same machine. Chris, if you were going after this as an attacker, what would you go for?
Credit card numbers.
Of course, everybody's swiping credit cards, right? I'm putting a credit card on tab at the bar. That's probably encrypted, but in memory, that's in clear text. That's how a lot of people go after ATMs.
Yeah.
So notice here in this video, these attackers are actually learning through. They probably don't know how this point of sale machine works, right? They're stumbling through this point of sale machine, trying to figure out, and it looks like it's embedded Windows 7 is what that looks like. And they're trying to figure out, are my files copying? How does this work, right? It's each one of these is kind of hilarious, watching how each one of the attackers is learning through, trying to figure out how this works. So we'll keep letting it go in as they stumble through. All right, there we go, Windows 7 embedded. So they're going to the task manager, trying to figure out what products are running, right? Trying to figure out. Right, I saw LabTech VNC running, so LabTech RMM in this case, and obviously control is what they're using. But take a look at this. This is a unique one. They identified this machine was worthwhile. Credit card machines. So what do? They install TeamViewer, right? They're looking for that long-term persistent access. So this is one of those great cases of knowing thyself when we talk about detection later. You know, if TeamViewer is not used in your network, being able to gather this inventory of like how they're using it. Notice they're deleting icons off their desktop, clearing out the recycle bin.
Yeah.
You know, they go and create a TeamViewer access. Chris, do you have anything you were going to add?
Yeah, this is just a real tricky one because TeamViewer is a legitimate application. So when they put that down there, and it doesn't matter what AV you're running, what EDR you're running, it's not going to detect it as malicious because it's a legitimate application. The only case where, like here, we know it's malicious is because we know that the attacker installed it, that it's not something that was added by the end user or the MSP. And so from a securing this perspective, some of these things are really hard to detect. You have to have that context to know that the MSP is not the one who installed TeamViewer. It's not supposed to be there.
Yeah. So I got one of the questions that came through. I'm holding questions to the end that somebody asked of like, does EDR, next generation antivirus, make a difference here? And it might be able to detect routines differently, but let's be real. Like in this case, some of these machines had admin privileges.
That one,
Or
that one definitely did.
Yeah,
You
this
saw
one
everything was running as administrator.
Yeah, so everything installed the program files was running as admin. No matter what your AV vendor or next-gen AV vendor tells you of, we have a password that can prevent our software from being uninstalled. If somebody's escalating to system administrator privileges or system privileges in Windows, Chris, is there a single way, like a single product that you think can stop you from being able to disable? Even like some that have kernel drivers, right?
Because you can then shut off the service that runs the driver, which will remove the driver from memory.
Or call the ioctls. That's a fancy technical word for like the API features or the interface for the drivers to disable those features.
Right. There's a lot of security products that try to
make it harder.
They try to make it harder, right? Because they know attackers are going to try to disable them and stuff. So they'll do things to make it so that you can't remove the driver or different things so you can't disable them. So it's not necessarily super easy, but it's also not impossible at the same time because they still have to leave the ability for the users to uninstall the EDR product if they no longer want it or something like that. So so there are ways around it, but yeah, they try to raise the bar at least a little bit to make it not super easy to disable.
So for those that hadn't followed along or seen our saga, this all started on a Reddit post that was, about a week ago. And somebody said, hey, Kaseya VSA was used. And notice that when Huntress chimed in initially, we were still gathering data, right? This is on the 20th of June, 2019. And we said, hey, we've seen 2 cases of this Sodinokobe ransomware being used, but not with Kaseya VSA. We actually, in those previous cases that we had seen, we saw RDP as the initial access. It was a lot of brute forcing to get in and from the logs that we had recovered. But we just started out gathering data, right, John? We were like, oh, we hadn't seen this. We'd been talking to a handful of MSPs that got hit, but we really didn't know. And you see, like, we even started this with happy to, sign an NDA to coordinate. We've now signed a couple of these, right? Some partners just said, I don't care about an NDA. I want to educate, right? So we're all ears and we're all open. What we haven't seen is too many actual vendors go and send like actual indicators of compromise. But this just started out as they had manually uninstalled WebRoot like you saw in those videos. But notice as this kind of escalated, not only had we spoke to the larger MSP that became public later, but we had actually said, hey, hold tight on any speculation of what was going on. And if you notice, all within the same day, what were we at, 11:25? 2 hours later, we had got copies of WebRoot's management console. And this is a big change in tradecraft or techniques that were used by the hackers that we believe are the same attackers or same hackers because they're using same tradecraft. And in some cases, the exact same naming scheme, the exact same payloads. That doesn't mean there's not a red herring issue, right? Where somebody's like trying to copy or mimic somebody else. Well, let's pivot what we mean by this, because you see we actually called out, we have confirmation of WebRoot's management console used as the initial access mechanism.
Yeah.
And that should be...
At this point, I still think we were under the impression that there was one MSP was breached, one attack methodology was used. As we continued to look into this and more people reached out to us, we were able to get confirmation that not just WebRoot was used. VSA was used to pass out stuff. Screen Connect was used to put out stuff. So
TeamViewer, obviously, for persistence.
If you read through the initial updates, at that point, our expectation was still we'd only seen WebRoot being used. So that's kind of where our thinking was on that. Some people came back later and said, hey, it wasn't just WebRoot. So we just wanted to clarify that.
Cool. So this is, for those that haven't seen, I know the screenshot gets small, but this is an actual exported log from one of our, one of our friends in the community. They're not even a partner, right? The gentleman that was behind this just said, look, I realize that security is a team sport. I want to get you as much information as possible. He rang us actually on the phone, got a hold of our sales team pitched it over to John's team, and got us a copy of these logs. And if you see, they actually used WebRoot here to kick off a command. And that might shock some folks that don't use WebRoot. Maybe there's other AVs. It wouldn't shock me at all if other AVs have the ability to run a command.
It shocked us.
Yeah, I was totally shocked when I heard it. I was like, that can't be.
One of our partners called us and said, hey, we believe they used WebRoot to compromise us. Yep. And we all said, no, that's highly unlikely. But, when we started talking with them more, they actually told us that, no, you can use WebRoot to run commands. And they sent over the log. And sure enough, you could see in the log that it was they used a malicious PowerShell command to download an additional payload from Pastebin.
I mean, part of that transparency, I always laugh when I take a look at some of my tweets in hindsight. And this is one of those, like when we're talking about, hey, we were just sharing these things or just learning these things, you can actually see, here's me on June 20th. Today I learned some antivirus allows admins to download and execute files, right? Download and run a file, run a DOS command, run a registry command. Right? So we're learning these stuff on the fly too. Despite being your security experts in the community, we usually are on top of this. We had actually spoke to somebody at DattoCon and told that MSP that later, was involved in one of these many scenarios that they told us that WebRoot was used, and we actually denied on spot. Nah, that's unlikely. WebRoot wasn't compromised. It seems unlikely. No, it wasn't compromised. It was a credential, and they just abused that feature.
All right. So we got a couple of questions here. What was the start 1488.exe file added to ConnectWise control toolbox or just via the client upload tool?
So what was the start file added to screen control? So
the upload.
Oh, was uploaded. Yeah, it was uploaded via Screen Connect control, whatever you want to call it. I'll make this a little bit bigger. And then they manually double clicked it. So they were actually using exported logs. And I might even have a redacted screenshot that another one of our partners shared with us that we had seen this in the past. In case nobody had seen this before, let's see if it's in this here. VSA, control, state of the source, WebRoot today. We recently observed and reported that was named. So this is actually a screenshot from another partner showing their instance of control, of where it actually used the sent file feature from control. And notice here, this is an actual indicator of compromise. Once again, about sharing indicators, this is an IP the attacker came from. I gotta believe us as the MSP community, we probably have all kinds of logs that show where they remoted in from. Where did they push this from Screen Connect? How can we start blocking this as whole? We tried to do our best in this instance when we started realizing that most of these attacks that I'll share were using Pastebin. We did our best to advise, like, look, you could consider blocking access to Pastebin. However, we caveated it's a pretty fragile, pretty limited. As soon as the attackers move from Pastebin, that's something along those lines. Let's get this train back on the tracks.
We got a couple more here, actually. They also asked, like, are the attackers password spraying? I.e., are they just trying to brute force in?
Yep. So that's for those that don't know about password spraying, it's a little bit different than brute forcing. The concept of password spraying typically means I have a bunch of your users that maybe you have a lockout period. Say you have a 5-minute, 15-minute lockout period. You have enough users that I'm gonna spray a password or try to reuse a password on John, and then I'm gonna wait 60 seconds and get it on Chris. Then I'm gonna go to Kyle. Then I'm gonna go to Monica and Andrew and all of the Huntress staff. By the time that I've rotated through, I might have tried John 2 times, Chris 2 times, me 2 times, etc. So by the time I do my 3rd time, which was maybe lock out the account, that duration has reset, right? Or the account duration allows you to be able to fly under the radar. So we don't know, Jason. That was the gentleman who asked this question. Jason Hahn actually said, is password spraying being used? We bet Kaseya and we bet WebRoot or any of the other vendors that might have seen this brute forcing might be able to provide that details. From what we've heard from those vendors, they're just seeing one successful login.
Right.
So with that said, if you have a case of where maybe your control or Screen Connect or any of the software was brute forced, that's a great indicator of compromise we as a community would love to know, because we still don't know from the limited threat intel we still know about. We just know when it comes to the vendors and logging into these vendor portals, it's one successful password logon is what they're telling us. Which that's obviously the question is, why don't you have MFA or 2FA? But we'll save that for just a little bit. If we look at these payloads the attackers are using, command.exe is being used. It's a legitimate command prompt. You're calling the start moniker or start verb, right? So a little bit of indirection here. So whether you're next gen or regular AV, maybe this is to start getting around it. So we go to see command.exe to start to PowerShell, and it's using an obfuscated payload here. Thankfully, I've got all the malware, so we could see this all day long, that not only was webroot, and we see this case was going out and running one of these batch files, we could see what these batch files were doing, and we actually shared it here when we were sharing some of the threat intel. You could see, look, PowerShell-based payload. And so you can actually see not only the screenshot that we have, but you can actually see the pastebin page, which is now removed, but we saved a copy of the payload onto our GitHub. So for anybody looking for some of those commands, these are all out there. And we'll share all these links afterwards in some of the follow-up from the webinar. But you can see that it goes, and this is the batch file that it was using, and this is the decoded payload. Invoke execution. They make sure that even if they're on a 64-bit box, they're using 32-bit PowerShell payloads. They're downloading it from pastebin, and then running this all in memory with a whole bunch of sleeps in there to keep this process running. Invoking execution, running it in memory. I know that gets technical for the non-technical people, but I got to imagine there's some techies that want to see under the hood. So real quick from that demonstration, we can actually see, and these are all examples of payloads that we had seen here. I'll just grab one of them. And we could see this is some of that invoke randomly named payload. And this is an actual pen testing tool that they've modified. You see this do not zero MZ and force ASLR. This is a tool that's part of, John, was it PowerShell? It's PowerSploit and PowerShell Empire, you're right. Yep. You can see this is that actual GitHub pen testing tool that if we go look for some of these things, like, for instance, do not zero, they're actually using some of these legitimate features for pen testing, but using it for nefarious purposes. Some of the difference of what they've reused and how they've changed some of this is we see even on the bottom, they actually embedded a payload. So at the bottom, they've got this big, giant base64 encoded payload, right? So they're not actually storing the DLL on disk in a EXE or a DLL form to get you caught. Think about this, command.exe, which was running under the context of a user that was coming from Screen Connect, then calling start, then calling PowerShell, which I think then called another PowerShell, which was the 32-bit version, which downloaded this from pastebin, a legitimate website that would go through like your DNS filters, your firewall. You know, if you're not explicitly blocking it, PowerShell, or excuse me, pastebin has a good reputation. And then we see here the DLL, and I've actually carved out the DLLs, and all these have been shared and uploaded. But for any of those that are interested, no, there's nothing really special about these DLLs, right? MZ for the header, and they're using a technique called reflective injection. That's as technical as we'll get for this. But for anybody that's looking, we actually shared copies, all the pastebin payloads. Let's go back to the slides. I see we're already 40 minutes in this, but there's a lot to share here. And I think we still keep getting questions and people aren't leaving, so let's keep it going. So Chris, would you add anything here? Or John, the attackers use webroot. This is a big change, right? Remember those first attackers, they had logged into that partner's webroot portal.
Yeah, we were just speculating that, we were talking about that this morning, at whether they had actually realized that they could do this, or if they evolved and figured out after the fact. Because it doesn't make sense. Why not use it? Because they were doing it all manually. They could have hit every computer instead of just, I don't remember how many they hit, but it wasn't maybe 10 or 15% of the total.
Yeah.
So one good question that somebody asked earlier was about passwords, right? You know, hey, is there a chance that maybe there was a potential vector that was exploited, that some cloud-based password management system was used and abused, which is a really great question. We've asked almost all of our partners that we knew were compromised, whether with WebRoot through this mechanism or Screen Connect or VSA or any other product, right? There's any product could be used and abused. And there has been password management software, like internally we use LastPass. It's not because LastPass is the greatest or best, it just worked for us. Other partners used other things. What were some of the ones they mentioned, John? RoboForm, but we haven't found one single password management system, right? If you started thinking that, because we're looking still, trying to connect all these dots. So maybe there is like one central password management system. We just haven't seen it yet because a lot of our partners didn't use LastPass, they didn't use WebForm. Some used their own internal like IT glue type password system. Some used a better like put all my passwords in one place, like a LastPass that'll actually say like, ooh, WebRoot and VSA use the same credential. That's dangerous. You should change it and warn you. So, but we haven't seen it yet, folks. So that was a good indicator. What's really interesting here is if you take a look at this, see this command.exe /C for start PowerShell and running all those commands. If you take a look at the same team that we gave props to earlier, which was from the UBX Cloud side of the house, they had actually shared some of their indicators. You give me a second because I'm going to be searching this on the fly. They were great, and part of our partners that reached out to us shared the same thing that what UBX Cloud shared, which was more or less screenshots of actually showing, look, here's a redacted VSA console. Here they're actually, theirs was called news copy test, which was nothing more than copying some of the files. And if we go to the other screenshot, which shares this or shows us even better, you can actually see this was using a procedure within Kaseya that writes the file 1488.bat. Notice that other one was called start 1488. That doesn't, it's not a smoking gun, but it's interesting. All operating systems need to copy this file and then execute this file, execute it with PowerShell, execute shell command. They're just trying to make sure this sucker is executed. And what was cool about this is we actually got a copy of the 1488 files from one of our other partners. So keep in mind, we're like now 3 or 4 partners deep of sharing this threat intel with us. And take a look at this. This is a great example of where all these kind of show a great story. Start, 1488.bat was once again using command.exe, using start with that same obfuscated PowerShell. And if we go and deobfuscate or decode, it's not, you know, that PowerShell there and look at it, once again, oh gosh, fail well here. Let's do it on the fly. Decode some base 64. All right, base 64, decode this thing on the fly, and we'll notice the exact same. Make sure if it's on a 64-bit environment, use the 32-bit PowerShell. Download this from a new paste bin, right? So we see a new random paste bin. And we started noticing this no matter which partner, whether it was Screen Connect, was using the EXEs, but some of these other tools that were easier running for whatever reason they chose to use PowerShell, maybe for obfuscation or that indirection, we noticed that they had moved to a batch file or some type of command, whether it was WebRoot using the DOS command or VSA using this wrapper more or less around it. So that was neat. And that was actually a big indicator for us. We could start looking for some of the random paste bin articles. Going all back to the very top, notice that the actual Huntress team not only found, we're looking at each one of these things, not only found one paste bin article on the 20th, by the 21st, we had actually found and now removed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 total of these, each one having a different DLL that more or less did the same. All right, so flipping back to some Q&A, there were some of the questions of like, what can attackers do here to decrease their attacker, you know, the attack vectors?
Well, so yeah, so Jason Slagle asked, what can vendors do to their agents to decrease their attack vector? There are vendors creating agents in a variety of languages that wouldn't run as a super user normally.
Yeah, so that's real. Like, there is definitely a threat when it comes to some of these products of, are they running with escalated privileges and don't need to? One of the great questions that came from the group that was in MSP, gosh, what was it? MSP Geek was the one that asked me of this. And MSP Geek said, can Huntress run without admin privileges? But because of the data that we gather, and John actually, his team develops that agent.
Yeah, we wouldn't be able, there would be a lot of data that we just wouldn't be able to see.
Right, there's a lot of data that's indicators of compromise protected by Windows in the registry, with like trusted installer or system privileges that we just wouldn't be able to see. However, vendors should definitely take a step back and say, how do I run this with the least amount of privileges as possible? Even internally, right? We actually teach a class at Black Hat that every year we teach one called Fuzzing for Vulnerabilities, right? And this is definitely not a plug or anything like that. What we want to share is people attend this class to figure out how do they find places where they're running with too many privileges, right? Fuzzing for vulnerabilities, here's our class that we teach. And part of that is how can I actually find and fuzz and find places where maybe I'm doing bad code, but also am I elevating privileges? And we see this all the time. So vendors really need to take a step back and ask themselves, right? Get a company to do an external audit. We're even asking ourselves, even though we do our own teaching people how to fuzz, it's probably about time that internally from Huntress, we look and have our own code assessments by an external party and then share those findings, right? That's a good practice to, whether, put it all out there. It's not about are you vulnerable, right? It's about if you're vulnerable, how do you find it proactively and share it? So I think that's something you'll see from Huntress probably this year that we'll actually commission. They get a little expensive, but we'll do it. Let's go back to some of the Q&A fun.
So we had an anonymous person ask, it's kind of a two-part question. Would the ransomware still be able to be deployed on a machine locked down with UAC? And then also, what if the user was running as a standard user as opposed to an admin?
John's been too quiet, and I'm going to lose my voice in like 2 seconds. Share the UAC thing.
So on those, I think UAC would have prevented some of it from being running, especially like if you didn't have the ability to disable antivirus. So in the case of Windows Defender, if they weren't admin, they wouldn't have been able to disable. Same with the web root. And if it ran as a standard user, it would have only encrypted that user's data most likely. It wouldn't have hit all the shares, all the other users that are on the system.
Right.
So it still would have affected you, but the damage would have been minimized.
Yep. That's one of those, making sure minimizing how much privileges people have to share drives. One of the videos that we had and screenshots we had where the actual attackers went and verified, were there any external USB drives plugged in? And were there any map share drives? And they actually went in some of these videos, right-clicked on the shared drive and reconnected to it to make sure that when the ransomware was spidering, it got it. And think about it, even if you weren't admin privileges, if that user was able to read everything on your shared drive, that's no good, right? That's one of those making sure you're managing your privileges.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of cases where we've talked to partners and said, hey, how come your users really shouldn't have admin access or local admin access? Why do they? And usually it comes down to they got annoyed with every time they wanted to install something or change something, they had to put in a ticket, and it didn't work out well for them. But ultimately, that can lead to really bad stuff like this. Being able to turn off or uninstall antivirus, things like that. So it's a tough thing. You kind of got to figure out where the trade-off is there: security for usability. If you can, we would absolutely recommend your users are not admin users. It just opens up so many more attack vectors that weren't there before.
I was going to say, one thing to add to that is when the attackers had connected via Screen Connect, if the machines were locked, because some of this was done in the middle of the night. So if the user hadn't been logged in, they would have had to authenticate locally to the machine, which might have slowed them down or prevented. There was one where we had a video of they connected to a host and it was locked and they just disconnected.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great successful scenario. So guys, being technical founders, this is clearly, we get all hyped up about the nerdy geek stuff. But let's pivot.
Some of the simple things.
Yeah, we're 50 minutes into this thing, and we said we were going to talk about detection and response. So just in case anybody here that needs has to jet at on the top of the hour, let's make sure. Let's talk about some of the prevention, right? The obvious prevention ones to get it out of the way. There is a common theme here in almost all these, which is somehow credentials are getting in here, and this will be the one time I say it. But your 2FA, MFA, I get it. It sucks. Your password manager, making sure you truly have a unique password on each one of those can go a long way. I get it. They cost. It's something that your customers are going to tell you, look, I don't see any value. I'm not going to perceive the value. I don't want you to upsell me. That's an actual sales problem. But when you're looking for a solution, it goes a long stinking way. Albeit, it does need to be a two-factor solution that's hardened as well. right? So we've seen some people that advise, and even though I'm not screen sharing, if you guys Google real quick, you could probably look, I think it was GitHub that might have got compromised recently, where the attackers came in and actually got around because SMS was used for two-factor. That's really tinfoil hat. That's a really sophisticated attack where somebody's getting an SMS, but it's way better than nothing, right? Absolutely better than nothing. Even webroot, right? I know people were bashing on like, hey, it was only using the first 6 characters and randomly choosing 2, and it's really one factor twice, but it's still a low enough bar that it might have worked. Absolutely move to something like TOTP or Duo push notifications or FIDO or anything like that for your two-factor, but that goes a long way, and that's enough of that said in regards to two-factor. What else things could we have done, right? How could you harden these environments for prevention?
Oh, boy.
That's the face of we've been scratching our heads for a couple days saying, if we were the attackers, how would you stop us? Right? You can move to great next-gen AV products and things like that. They might be too expensive for your customers. That's a sales problem. That's not technical problems. And we've seen the same SentinelOne, Cylance, Carbon Black, Deep Instinct. We've seen all these products get run over by ransomware or by a sophisticated attacker. Nothing is perfect. So we tend to focus a little bit more on how could you detect this? And maybe one of the things that nobody is saying that we actually, with our MSP partners, we actually found way more important than even the detection was how do you be able to respond and recover? And maybe that's something that we can actually share for the last 10 minutes. We'll go beyond 10 minutes till people stop or tell us to go home. But one of the cases that you might not realize is your MSP or even your IT department, because we got direct customers as well in the Fortune 500. You're able to handle, the marketing department got ransomware. You got enough people in the IT department or the MSP to handle that. What you don't have enough people to handle is every subsidiary or every single client that you manage whatsoever is all encrypted with ransomware at the same time. And that's an elephant in the room nobody's talking about.
Right. Yeah, it's tough. Imagine you have 300 clients and they're all calling you at the same time. They're all very upset because their computers are down, they can't do any of their work, because they themselves have their own customers who are probably standing in their office or calling them saying, hey, I'm trying to do this and I can't get in. So you're going to have to think about how do you deal with that kind of stuff? How do you handle responding, to 300 customers at the same time? Some of the things that we've seen work well were some of our customers actually went in and changed their phone message. So most people have some sort of call center type setup where users can call and get connected with support. We had customers change the message that said, hey, we're having an outage. We've had ransomware. We're working to restore it. Here's our timeline. Here's where we're at. And they continue to update it, as they progress and as they get customers back online. But that helps at least educate a little bit, some of your users. So if they're calling and no one's answering, instead of them just thinking no one's there, they'll at least know, okay, they're not answering because they're dealing with the incident that I'm calling about.
At Huntress, when we find a global incident that we need to call customers because it is hitting the fan, our actual sales and marketing team becomes threat ops notification responders and starts calling customers to let them know. This is a wake-up call that, whether they got in through Connect or maybe they just brute forced your RDP because you had a weak password policy or you had an RDP exposed. Regardless of the incident, when somebody gets in and it's mass, you need to have a role play even, right? There, in the DoD, where we all kind of came from, we did tabletop exercises where you should probably have some sort of tabletop exercise and maybe even a quick script. It doesn't have to be great. It can be super technical. That your sales team has to realize that it is time to put your sales hat down and you are now in customer management mode. We've now seen lawsuits up the wazoo that come as a result of these. Think about it. One MSP partner with 100 clients. Now those 100 businesses are down. How big is that ripple for all the customers they support? There's a real chance of lawsuits here. And oftentimes the difference between an actual lawsuit and just another incident is how quick can you respond and how well did you maintain that relationship. So as the sales team, you better believe it's time to turn on that freaking charm. Whatever charm that allowed you to close that deal with that relationship, you better be proactively notifying the people that matter, right? The CEO of these companies, and giving them the steps of, what if your trucking company can't deliver packages today? What if your t-shirt company can't print t-shirts?
Yeah.
What if your law firm can't respond to court cases because everything's like, that's the type of thing that you need to have in your battle cards. And we now have some of these in Huntress internally, that when we have to do it, how do we enable our own sales or marketing folks be able to talk technical about this? The CEO. Unfortunately for the CEOs or presidents or operators that are on these calls, your job is not technical. My job is not technical here at Huntress. Your job is to go and get on the horn and call every one of, think about it as a Venn diagram. Who are the customers most likely to sue? Who are the customers that have a lot of revenue that are going to take your own business down? Make that Venn diagram and analyze who overlaps. Because no offense, that's who's your CEO. He only has, or she only has, so much time to make phone calls.
Yeah, prioritize for sure.
Yep. We see most actual partners that we engage with that the most significant contribution the Huntress team makes is being able to install some framework. And we're actively working on some of this framework right now. You know, maybe even if it's just a PDF that says, when things hit the fan, here's how do you handle an incident, right? Think about a crude incident response plan that we're kind of working on, and we're going to open source it. You know, maybe even partners give us better feedback than we come up with ourselves. But it's time for us to adopt some of this strategy. So some of the things that actually asked was some of the quick questions about strategy. You know, what strategy would you suggest that MSP take to balance the demand of resolving issues quickly and the need for security and locking down these features from our tool set? This is going to apply both to your incident response and your prevention, right? John already hit it. Prevention, I don't care, even if it has to be a 60-minute screen lockout period. Most of these attacks that we're seeing, they happen at odd hours. Maybe that's the attacker because it's actually 12 hours ahead for them. Maybe they just know you're at home, so they're kicking out these attacks at 10 p.m. But regardless, when it's control or screen connect, they're logging in. You need some type of mandatory screen lockout. If you look at any of the NIST framework or HIPAA, most of them call for that type of prevention. If you're not auditing your GPOs, and I don't mean trust that you said your GPOs, but some sort of verification that you actually have that password policy, you actually have a lockout policy, I mean, yeah, you're going to take the risk that if the only thing that you do on this display computer is show somebody's PowerPoint that says, welcome to our company, right? It's that kiosk machine. You need to realize the risk you're taking by not doing that, right? You want to provide access to the kiosk machine. You don't want it getting locked every 2 seconds, but you need to balance that.
Right. Yeah, and if you just do one or the other, you're going to end up with issues. Like Kyle said, if you don't do screen lockout, you're going to have issues. But if you only do screen lockout but without a password policy, users are just going to get annoyed by, oh, the screen's locking all the time. Well, I'll just make the password ASDF, so it's like super easy to unlock, right? So without that password policy to enforce them to have a password with enough characters and containing numbers and uppercase and special characters, those kind of things, the users are always going to take the easiest path, and we want to kind of try to guide them in the correct path without making it making it too onerous. So there's going to have to be a lot of feedback here, right? Like, you're going to have to do things and then talk to your users and say, hey, how is this? Does this work for you? What's a pain? Are you using this? Like, those kind of things, to get feedback. But I actually took that question in slightly different. I don't know how it was intended, but I kind of looked at that question from the standpoint of the MSPs. Like, how do the MSPs go from where they're at today to make sure that they're like more secure?
Ooh,
like what's the path for them there? And the one thing that I wanted to just to tell everybody is, like, security is not a one and done. It's a constantly evolving thing. You're adding new tools. You're going to have to continue revisiting your security. It's kind of an endless rotation of, let's look where we're at. Let's evaluate what we're doing, what we're not doing, and then let's kind of prioritize and let's start hitting off the most simple things. So
great conversations for a QBR with your customers too.
Yeah.
If you have to pitch them. I didn't mean to jump in the way, Chris, but something that came out that reminded me. John's team on ThreatOps sees Emotet and TrickBot. These are ransomware that spread laterally, or not ransomware, and malware that spreads laterally and just inundates a network. They see more propagation that happens because of not using segmentation. So A lot of John's conversations, and won't put words in your mouth, but even those kiosk machines, right, that you were talking about, maybe segment them into their own VLAN or their own DMZ. And that was actually a suggestion from, I think, Dominic Kirby in there said that. But you got anything else to add, John, on how you could have that conversation about segmentation? That's a project, right? It's project-based work.
Yeah, that's difficult because you're redesigning your network from the ground up.
Right.
And takes some downtime, but it's definitely one of those things that would, anything that you can do to prevent, in the case of like Emotet or TrickBot, those things drop ransomware too. So once they get on your network, if they spread everywhere, they're just another way to drop ransomware, and then you're hosed. So
yeah.
Let's be real. I think where Chris was
more
getting
work up front, but maybe in the long run it'll save you.
Chris was sharing that you've got to be able to do these audits, or you got to be able to do this know thyself. Maybe you take like Cybersecurity Awareness Month. What is that, October or something like that?
I think so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Maybe you make that your month that you just reassess your own architecture, right?
Right.
Maybe, that could be, and I'm not saying it needs to be once a year, but even if you do it regimented once a year, I won't put anybody on blast, but let's be real, that's probably better than most.
Yeah.
And we just see that case that a lot of people, it was a thought, and then an employee leaves. It'd be even better if you could afford to do and take the downtime once a quarter. But let's be real, like we have businesses to run. We have to reassess. So I think it's way more important that even if you were doing a minimal amount of this reassessment, like for instance, maybe October, the first week of October is, let's just spend some time doing geo-filtering. What products can we geo-filter so you can't connect to WebRoot from this IP?
Right.
That feature might not exist.
Yeah. I mean, you just do it iteratively, right? Like start with the lowest hanging fruit. So maybe that's like, hey, right now all of our techs are just using whatever password they want. Let's get everybody set up with something like a LastPass where we can go in and tell all of our techs to say, hey, put all of your passwords in here and make sure a password that you use is never used on the same system twice, right? Do that and then worry about the next stuff. A lot of people kind of get caught up. They see this list. There's all these advanced things. They go and they try to do the advanced stuff first. Just chip away at the list. You don't have to do it all at once. Start with password managers. Get 2FA set up. Make sure none of your users have admin, right? You chip away at it as time goes. And so you're not going to just change everything on your customers all at once. You can ease them into it. And that way you can show them like, hey, look, here's all the things we suggest you should do. Here's what you've done. Here's what you haven't done. What else can we get you doing, to both help you and help us? So
I will do a plug. I'm going to go and screen share here real quick, just because I thought this was like a fantastic plug. One of the things that actually came in when people were looking for call to action, notice this even within the MSP community, which is exactly what we need. So huge kudos to, oh gosh, Santa Stabber is the name. I'm doing a webinar and I had to say Santa Stabber. Well, huge kudos to Santa Stabber here for at least saying, let's team up. And they came up with a handful of these great things. For instance, use a good 2FA training. Some of them are a little bit tinfoil hat, worried about the aliens and all the crazy stuff. Right. But they're, you don't have to adopt all of them, right?
And that kind of goes back to what I was saying. Like, there's some advanced stuff in here. Like one of their suggestions is put each one of your techs on a separate VLAN. That would be great, but that's pretty advanced. Make sure you're doing the easy stuff first before you're worried about the advanced stuff. We had some people reach out to us this week and say, oh, I hope this webinar is not just all about like use good passwords and do 2FA. And while it's not, and we don't want it to be, you got to do the basic stuff before you can get to the advanced stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of them, right? For us, we actually teamed up with the team at Duo, and no joke, July 11th now, we're doing a demo with Duo. We use it internally. I think it's a pretty great product. They offer 50 NFR licenses or something like that to MSPs. You can use any two-factor. I mean, I'm not getting paid by Duo to say this, by the way. No. But for us, we went and looked and said, hey, where does it matter? So huge call out for that. If anybody's interested, it's going to be similar technical stuff, a little bit more bounded, a little bit more less off the cuff. Right. But that's a whole thing for anybody that's interested. You can sign up at that link there from the HubSpot link. But maybe we've been talking about a lot of the detection. We talked about some of the prevention. recovery is something nobody talks about for some reason. And I would argue it's just as important as your prevention. Obviously, the ounce of prevention is worth the whatever pound of everything, pound of cure.
Pound of gold, maybe?
Yeah, a pound of gold. Maybe an ounce of prevention sometimes is worth your business. But what we've actually seen more realistic, instead of that BS metric that people claim, what is it, 60% of small businesses go out of business after a breach, after X amount of days, which is complete garbage, right? Yeah. We see incidents every day. We know this is garbage. Way more likely if something that actually matters is, have you thought about how you're going to handle the scenario when, right, we got 3 of us here, we're running an MSP, we've got 10 employees. Now you've got 100 customers that are actually, all owned at the same time, all ransomed at the same time. That type of playbook of making sure your technicians are organized, more realistically is, have you ever even tested your backup at scale? So I'll give you some transparency. One of our MSPs that had 2,000 endpoints hit with ransomware all at the same time, not only could the pipes not handle from the cloud-based backups they had, some of the actual backup vendor was having to ship hard drives. And then some of the hard drives were broken in transit. And the actual vendors, right, the actual bandwidth was saturated between there by doing 2,000 restores of giant files at the same time. That is a reality. Unfortunately, it took you, an hour to do your backup? What's our magic number that we typically take that sees restoring? Is it,
what did they say yesterday? 3 to 4 times?
Yeah, 3 to 4x. So if your 1 terabyte took you, 2 hours to back up to the cloud, count on it taking even longer when it's restoration, especially when you're doing this in mass. So when you're given projections of, we'll have you up in 2 weeks. Well, maybe you'll have them up in 6 weeks.
Right.
We've also seen MSPs band together. Groups like IT Nations Evolve, ASCII, things like that. I don't know enough about the content, to say, they're clearly worth it from a business standpoint. But what we've actually learned is some of these MSP partners actually reach out to each other and send each other technicians because they know if they were down, they would want to be able to have that surge capacity on reserve. That's what this community needs, right? We need to kind of, band of sisters, band of brothers to come together and say like, hey, it's time for us to help each other out. Same thing for vendors, right? We send silly stuff like, care packages of food because most people don't think about like, oh, you just got hit with ransomware. Your technicians are working a 24-hour shift tonight. How are you going to feed them? Who's running the shower schedule? How do you make sure people are getting enough sleep? Can you set up an NDA real quick with maybe you have a spouse that takes care of the kids Monday through Friday, but when those kids are at school, can she come in and read your same sales script? You're going to want an NDA. You're going to want to minimize liability. All that stuff comes into these things. You got to think outside of the box of how do you keep your company running when these are happening, right? This is a reality of how you keep your MSP from being sued or maybe minimizing your liability. Speaking of liability, someone want to take the insurance one? We've seen people use it. So we're not experts. I think that's probably the first disclaimer.
Yeah. I have seen people successfully use cybersecurity insurance. So that was one of the first things for me was like, hey, you got the cybersecurity insurance policy. What's the likelihood that it will pay out? Are they just going to deny your claim? All kinds of things like that. We've talked to some companies, and we've talked to a number of people who have successfully used it. So I can't say it's amazing. I can't say it's bad, but maybe somebody with some additional experience can say what kind of plans you should or should not buy, what types of things you should look out for in the contract that you're signing, those kind of things. But it's probably not a bad idea to have it.
So one of the things, and this is a great case of us educating each other. Let me go back to some screen share here real quick.
Do you know who that was?
Oh, no, I don't actually know who that is. We're getting off topic, being technical nerds here, right? That's that awkward silence. So somebody called out the Center for Internet Security. In case you've never heard of this, right? Nonprofit. I believe they actually administer the multi-state ISAC. ISAC is a group of folks that actually manage, usually for some type of vector of attacks. So there's a financial security, the FS ISAC. There's a critical security, the ES ISAC. I'm even hearing rumor, or at least calls to action, that maybe we need to, from this multi-state ISAC, which tends to be focused on SMB, Maybe there needs to be an MSP ISAC with these emerging threats. That's the stuff that we're want to see. But what's exciting about this is CIS actually release a top 50 and a top 20, controls. Sometimes they're behind an actual, paywall or behind a, hey, give me my information. I don't know if they hit you with spam. I've had a pretty good experience with them, so I'm definitely not going to throw them under the bus. We've seen most partners enjoy a whole lot what they get out of CIS or out of the multi-state ISAC. And what's crazy about it is even though they actually go every month and say, here's their advisories, and this is what we're seeing for malware, for our customers that see our actual threats, what's crazy is every month their list of Emotech, Covter, Zeus typically mimics the exact stuff we see. So they got good indicators of compromise. So huge props for the team that's there at CIS and the multi-state ISAC.
Yeah.
And huge, if you're looking for a simple framework, the CIS top 10 or top 50 controls are really good.
So we're about 15 minutes over. So that's pretty much what we have. If you wanna continue to hang out, we'll be here for a little bit longer to do some more Q&A. But
Monica, maybe do you want to unmute yourself and share us some questions that we just missed? We had Slack and all kinds of things going. There's probably some great questions.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Kyle?
Unmuted, but I don't hear. Maybe my speakers are terrible. This is the technical fun that you get to deal with when you're running a webinar. Everybody can hear her, but the people that need to hear her.
Really?
So that's clearly us being fail whales here.
Yeah, I'm signed in too.
Give me 1 second here, John.
We didn't test.
Hey, Kyle, can you hear me?
oh, and we got Andrew too. I can't hear him either.
There we go.
There we go.
Hey, guys. So there's a bunch of questions, probably 13, that I flagged for Answer Live. I've cleared out most of the ones that you guys have gone through, but if you just want to start maybe at the top, and I'll keep making sure that as people ask new questions, I'm flagging them as we'll answer live.
All right, we see the question. So one of them was, can you provide any guidelines on securing access to the RMM or control platforms such as Screen Connect? I've seen mentions of geo IP limits. Can vendors do more using things such as client SSL certs to help with this?
I looked this morning to see what your options were kind of for securing like control or Screen Connect. And it looked like you could absolutely turn on two-factor. They supported a bunch of different stuff, including just your generic like Google Authenticator, Windows Authenticator. They also supported Duo, a bunch of 2FA methods. I've heard a lot of people ask about geo IP filtering, like can we filter our networks so that no connections can ever come in or go out from Russia or China or insert other potentially malicious country. Yeah, you probably can. I don't know how much traction you're going to really get from those because it's real easy for anyone with some technical expertise to spin up an instance in Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, and those are going to come from places like Northern Virginia, California, right? You can buy any kind of VPS, like in a Rackspace or something like that. Super easy, very cheap. So geo IP filtering might get you a little bit, but it also might have a lot of false positives. So I don't know how worthwhile it is.
So I'm reading one more. Forgive me if I'm reading this and should be interpreted differently. It could be something as simple as an MSP's employees' Chrome Firefox password sync being used for convenience. If their Google or Firefox account is compromised and corporate client passwords are stored in there, game over. That is 1,000% realistic. Actually, I think I saw an MSP. He just responded. So Dominic Kirby at Curbside actually wrote a malware payload that we can plug or he can share in here, that its whole job is as soon as you land on a client, let me scrape everything out of your browser credentials. By the way, in case anybody doesn't know how that works, your browser credentials aren't magically encrypted. If you're running as that user, almost everybody, so this is Internet Explorer, it's definitely Chrome, Firefox is a little bit different, but they use what's called the Crypt Protect API. And that just says, as long as I'm this user, I can decrypt that. Right. So John, as an administrator, wouldn't be able to see and scrape those. But if your malware is impersonating or they have credentials, you're 100% right. This could just be as simple as I got access one time through a phishing email and I harvested browser credentials. So you're 1,000% right there, anonymous question. huge thanks for that, everybody.
So what Kyle's referring to when he says browser credentials is if you've ever logged in through your browser and it says, oh, hey, do you want me to save this username password type stuff? That's what we're talking about. And this has been brought up, 1,000 times to the Google Chrome security team, saying, hey, it's real easy if I'm the user for me to steal these credentials right out of here. And what their answer has always been is like, this is not a security feature. This is not something that we recommend people doing. It's a convenience thing. So even the Chrome security team suggests that you not do that. So I would avoid it if at all possible. Again, if you need to store passwords like that, definitely get yourself something like a LastPass, a 1Password, Authy, something like that's going to securely store your passwords and not just put them on the file system.
I'm going to do some sharing here from some private WePro malware dump. They're actual tools, right? They were using some of this stuff. And if we go actually take a look here at the actual payload, this payload itself was dumping the actual credentials from KeePass, I believe was. Yep, KeePass instances, and was carving it out of there. If anybody saw, even when I'm sharing, I've got LastPass in the browser extension plugin. That's part of the risk model, right? Perfect security doesn't happen. We've internally assessed, and we said putting those passwords and minimizing deduplication was, we're going to do defense in depth. We're going to use antivirus. We're going to obviously use our own product. Chris uses crazy, OS. We got all kinds of different operating system flavors in there as well, from Chromebooks to Mac to you name it. But I just want to make sure and caveat that's the case. And what Chris was mentioning about from the Chrome, this is Justin actually that runs Google's security team. And if you take a look, he's actually jumped in here, Justin Shu here, and said, look, on Hacker News, let me help explain why we do it. So this is actually out there for you guys to read, dating back to 2013. But they summarize it, if you want to put it in one sentence. If you're compromised on the endpoint, you've got bigger fish to fry, that from their perspective. Yeah. Still use defense in depth. We don't store our own. I actually disable my own Google Chrome password storage. I use LastPass instead, but keep that in mind.
What else we got? I know there was a whole list of questions going on there.
Yeah, there's some great Q&A stuff in here. So were any of the passwords used by the compromised MSPs and the pwned passwords database, right? So that's have I been pwned. Mm-hmm. That could be ID agent. We've seen some passwords of some MSPs that are in there. We haven't had an MSP confirm to us yet that they had it. More specifically, one MSP partner actually told us, we are 100% positive they were compromised through VSA. And they said, we are 100% positive that each one of our admins had a unique VSA password that was not used anywhere else. I don't know how they were 100% positive. Maybe they had it in LastPass. Maybe they had those things. When you start talking about your dirty laundry, not everybody wants to share. I get it. And this was like attributed. We didn't have an NDA, so I don't blame them. But I did want to share that, there is a chance that this could just be stuff from like the recent breach du jour. Maybe it's not some private MSP breach. But it is a little weird that we started seeing this increased focus in the last 6 weeks or so, especially the vectors of WebRoot, VSA, and control all appear to be attacked. That seems to suggest maybe it's some newer credential dump, if that's where it's coming from.
All of the vendors that we've talked to have said that what they're seeing is successful logins, not brute force attempts, not zero-day vulnerabilities. Just from their perspective, it looks like the user logged in. So all of that suggests that they're getting credentials from somewhere. We don't know where. Piecing that together is actually quite difficult because you'd have to talk to all of the affected parties, figure out what systems they've used, what share the same passwords, try to draw conclusions and find where the overlap is, and that's really time-consuming and hard to do. So we don't know where passwords are coming from, but it really does look like they're getting the credentials from somewhere.
So an interesting question here, John, I'm going to pitch it to you, was any opinion on AppGuard? I'm taking it they're talking about like App Locker, application whitelisting. That's how I'm going to interpret this question.
Yeah.
They asked about AppGuard, but specifically, from an offensive perspective, application whitelisting obviously raised the bar for us, right? We definitely had to get around application whitelisting. But what do you see from the threat up side? You know, most of these are legit third-party tools, so maybe expand on like the abuse of trusted applications, and even application whitelisting is great, but
Yeah, I was going to say in this case, like they were using PowerShell. You can't. Microsoft uses PowerShell all over the place in Windows, so it's hard to prevent that from running.
So in the case that AppGuard is like a specific vendor, I don't have enough knowledge. I know ThreatLocker is another MSP channel-focused vendor that they're trying to do like a cloud management of application whitelisting. What always kills in the enterprise environment, who definitely has, you know, $2 million security budgets to be able to do like application guard, device guard, application whitelisting, it's always the management, right? Hindering users' productivity is always the trade-off. So I think ThreatLocker's got a novel approach. I don't know enough about AppGuard, and I'm definitely not here to pitch any vendor's product, but it's a novel approach. There's a lot of bypasses. And how do you stop if you're using TeamViewer and they're using TeamViewer, or you're using Control and they're taking control of your RMM or PSA? I don't think your application whitelisting, you know, machine learning or not, next gen AV, it's a hard problem to solve. So, cool question. This is from Ravi. Why are MSPs not just locking down the ability to run EXEs and MSIs, even in folders like app data? John, you want to expand on that one too, since I kind of stole your question?
Let's say it again.
Yeah.
I was looking at the AppGuard thing.
Andrew is deleting the questions as fast as we get them up there, but it was, you know, why are people allowing programs to run out of app data and things along those lines? Why are people not locking down these endpoints?
Trying to think. I think there are several legitimate things that actually run out of app data.
Yep.
I think OneDrive. I'm trying.
A lot of installers will unpack their, like, there's a lot of installers that need two parts where they need to install something, reboot, and run something else. A lot of times what they'll do is drop the second part in app data and schedule a task to run it the next time the computer reboots. So like blocking stuff from there is hard.
You're not sharing your screen, and so we don't have any user data. Can you just jump into Huntress real quick and just search our entire database of all data and come back, and we'll follow up on that one. So what we're going to do, right? Huntress is giant amounts of like threat intel and just big data in general. So John's going to go search and see all the crazy stuff.
Things that run from there.
Visual Studio Code, which I'm using, definitely runs Zap data depending on how you install it. SolarWinds and Central, people are throwing all kinds of ones out there, so that's great. There's tons of these things.
You should do this one. Talk about laps.
Yeah.
Which one we got there?
This one.
Is there an automated tool that will remove domain users from local administrators group?
For some reason, I think the Windows group policy does that by default.
I think you can do some of that.
You can manage it with group policy. You can definitely add people to it.
So, and this is one of those cases, I think it may be a much more realistic thing that's a bigger danger, is the use of standard local admin passwords, I think, are the ones that I see way more like, damage done on that side. Don't get me wrong, that's underscoring the importance of removing users and things like that. But somebody asked me not too long ago on Reddit to poke holes in their security stack. And the one thing I called out was Microsoft has a free tool. It's for Active Directory environments called LAPS. The, local admin password solution.
Yep.
Free tool, and it'll rotate your local administrator passwords on whatever interval, every 30 days, every 60 days. And then straight from Active Directory, you can go in there and get that password. And that would be the process. When you need a local admin password, go get it. So that's something that's definitely underutilized. It can help you on your prevention side.
Right.
You know, that's slightly different than the attacks that we're seeing there, but it's totally worth calling out there.
Yeah, that's more for like, having RDP exposed or something like that. We strongly suggest that you do not expose RDP to the internet. We see a lot of people do it anyway. Usually it's because they need to do some sort of remote administration, and their kind of rebuttal is like, oh, well, we use strong passwords and stuff. But there are a lot of attackers who are constantly out there trying to brute force these things. And if there's ever a vulnerability in RDP, like we saw with Bluekeep, a few weeks ago, now you're potentially vulnerable. And who knows how long Bluekeep was potentially known by attackers and things like that. So we suggest you don't do it. Put it behind a VPN if you can. If you really have no way of getting around it, at least add some sort of two-factor to it. Like Duo has the ability for you to add two-factor such that after you log into the Windows machine, it will prompt you for your two-factor. And so that at least gives you another layer. But ultimately, try to remove all of those if you can.
Nothing better than on a live webinar to have water go down the wrong pipe.
Yeah.
Somebody had a question that I thought was actually really interesting was, what about just turning PCs off when you're not using them? So I know we did introductions really brief, but a little bit about Chris's background. Before he moved on over to the intelligence gathering side of NSA, he was actually on what's called NSA's Red Team, which is the part of the NSA government or part of the government that attacks DoD entities.
Yeah. We were like a persistent DoD penetration testing team. So the idea was every day I'd go into work and we would be working with some other DoD client trying to break into their network. And then we always went a little bit farther than that. Not only would we try to break in, but we would also try to demonstrate what capabilities an attacker could have after they broke in. So what kind of information did we have access to? What kind of things could we change that would potentially, hurt the DoD? Those kind of things. Where were you going with that?
Yeah, the reason I was specifically mentioning Chris's expertise is, he would have to aggress networks, and I can tell you from the offensive intelligence gathering side, some of your actual adversaries wouldn't have a machine that's on. And that's a literal hindrance of if your machines are shutting down on regular interval and you have the capability of wake on LAN for patching and stuff like that, you got to understand that's one of those like trade-offs. You got to measure and say like, oh, my machines are going off and they're not getting patched. But even for energy consumption, access for like control, hours that people can gather this data, making the attacker have to move somebody's mouse when they're on the machine. One of the videos that we actually watched, this was a computer that somebody was streaming Netflix on, and as soon as they identified that the user was on Netflix, they jumped off that computer right away. Like the video was like 3 seconds long.
Yeah, it was like a 3-second. You see the screen come up, it's a video, attacker, exit screen connect.
Yep. So caveating or adding to some of the previous questions, somebody confirmed, yep, GPO can specify who is built in to the administrators group, and it can delete all others. So that confirms John's suggestion. John, do you got a follow-up in regards to what legit apps run from app data?
I was seeing all sorts of stuff. McAfee cleanup utilities for updates. I saw trying to filter.
I know Chrome can be installed from user profile. It just depends on how it's. So that's one of those like trade-offs for sure. Keep sharing them as you find them.
What else do we got?
We've got a handful of left. I feel terrible. We're 90 minutes, but we still have a couple hundred people hanging with us. It looks like so. Let's keep the show going since these questions are solid. We've obviously covered various login credentials such as 2FA or password managers. For those of us using password managers, should we use longest character length supported, or should you be fine with certain minimum? That is an awesome question, and Microsoft recently changed their password rotation policy. So I think that's two things that we could talk about. I'm a huge fan of length at the end of the day for passwords, high entropy. When you enforce your password manager to always use the most extreme, I have actually ran into issues where the vendor or the site will support like a 65 character password and allows me to set my password, and then I go to log back in and it turns out they were only storing the first 32 characters and stuff like that. That's clearly bad programming. That's clearly terrible.
Mm-hmm. I had an issue like that on with Southwest.
Southwest Airlines?
Yeah, if you went to Southwest in the browser, I could log in fine. I had like a 20-some character password. Would log in fine. If I tried to use that same exact password from their app, didn't work. Couldn't log in. So they've since fixed that. But yeah, for a long time there were issues like that. I usually go with something that's at least 20 characters long, although I do run into sites where it's like, the maximum is like 16 and I got to reduce it to 16. But there's no need to go like crazy. Like you don't need to go like 120 character password. Like it's a bit overkill.
Yep. Someone added in there, NIST came out with a recommendation for passphrases. For NIST is obviously U.S. body for all kinds of standards. What is it? NIST 800-171 has all kinds of recommendations that the DoD uses for password, not just password, sorry, but the whole security framework. So that's a whole thing. NIST, actually, Don Kirby just showed up in here. NIST 800. What is it? 638? Is that what that says? 63B. So that's me not knowing my own NIST frameworks. Change the whole do we change our password every 10 minutes game. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of recommendation and guidance out here. It gets a little crazy, and this video will get dated if what we're suggesting today is not the best tomorrow. So I'll just leave it at password length has always gone very far, and that's somebody who's part of my job was mass cracking on large computers, complex passwords. So keep that in mind. What's your opinion on least privileged manager to only allow escalation for apps that require privileges? So I think this is what is that? There's a new channel product that we met some of those folks. Auto Elevate, is that their name?
Auto Elevate, yep.
So they've come up with a unique idea that they said, hey, can we mitigate and only allow certain applications to elevate? I look at it as both a novel idea and maybe fixing somewhat of a symptom and not just the problem too. And that's Huntress. Same thing could be said about Huntress. So nothing bad about the Auto Elevate problem. I think half the issue is why the heck are these users running as admins?
I think the only case where, in my mind, it's really going to be like required things like installing new software, right?
Yeah,
like
I got to install new software, or I've seen terrible old apps that require installing or running as admin.
Yep.
That's a good case of those. It's 2019. Stop letting your users run as admins.
Right.
That's not an excuse. I've even heard, and somebody had the comment earlier about insurance, right? Twofold. Insurance is going to get to their point that they're going to hold you accountable for bad practices and make the determination of whether they hold you liable or not. That's for real. Part of it is liability insurance. You're also going to need to think about what's your liability to customers. One caveat that was mentioned earlier too that I saw that was worth mentioning is when you're running that insurance or using that insurance, make sure you know your policy inside and out. Sometimes it only covers the third party and not your actual salary of your employees and things like that. So that's a really good insider tip from some of our MSP partners. An insurance policy is only as good as you can claim it. Just like a car, if all of a sudden you're driving, you find out you lend your car to your daughter and your daughter wasn't covered on your policy because family members weren't or something silly like that. Same thing goes for cybersecurity insurance. So auto elevating applications, going back to the initial question, I do think it's a good idea to be able to minimize. I also think about the business case though. As you're adding all these layers of security, you can have a really expensive cake made with all the best ingredients that nobody can afford to buy. So just like adding a Huntress or adding a two-factor and adding these, you need to be aware that part of your security, you're either going to tell people you're going to get these and just have to eat the margin or build that into your stack and only sell to people who can afford it, or you're going to have to layer your cake wisely for those cheap customers. Let's be real. That's a real problem for MSPs. Someone called out RDP has holes. Yeah,
it does now.
It definitely has holes. Right? For those that didn't see, right, the shameless or shameful, depending how you look at it, right? We actually dropped a blog on Bluekeep. Bluekeep vulnerability, for anybody who hadn't seen it, Bluekeep is that Microsoft vulnerability in RDP. There's been some other talks of maybe other operating systems are, that don't have patches. That's just talk. Supposedly more is going to come out at Black Hat. For those that haven't seen it, please feel free, jump in, blog.huntrusslabs.com. We got all kinds of nerdy stuff in there. But here's the actual blog on RDP and Bluekeep. Make sure you're patched. I mean, we still have partners that aren't patched.
Yep, unfortunately, yeah.
So, and we're actually telling them from the external, we see you're unpatched. This is real.
If we see you're unpatched, so do the other attackers.
So, all right, let's wrap up. I mean, I think we can see, we can only have 3 co-founders spend so much time on here before we got to actually go back to work. So I'm going to look at the last Q&A type stuff. Goodness. I'm currently working with a couple partners to work on ways to provision just-in-time access to MSPs. Very complicated, but if we could figure it out, that would help a lot. That's an interesting idea. I think they mean the sake of, like, similar to your RMM, and feel free if I'm butchering this for who asked that question. I think the concept of this one is Should you only allow, for instance, your RMM to run it on the fly? Should it not be a constant always on? But I see that some type of like, similar to auto elevate, is that also a just-in-time type problem. Only allow somebody to elevate when needed. Only allow the RMM, but I think bootstrapping might be one of those problems of, I need to update. I want my RMM to update around the clock. The computer only comes out of the closet once a month, and I want my product to be on demand. I think there's some good thoughts about minimizing your attack surface, and there's a lot of places at privileges, what security products, what privileges are running at, the user privileges, all those things. Should you allow RDP? Should you put it behind a VPN? All those are good things to minimize your attack surface, but I don't have enough thought on what that is. So, Andrew, I'm going to flip it back over to you, bud, real quick. Unmute this. Is there one last question you saw that really needs to be brought up? Because I think we could go forever for this. And then I'm going to leave it with my call to action here at the end. So please stay for my last call to action, which will be very motivational, I'm sure.
I think there's only 3 questions that are still in here, Kyle, so you can take your pick. There's one from Bill about your thoughts on using DLP to block executables that I don't think you've covered at all.
So I'm unmuting myself real quick. I've only seen data loss prevention. I think it's very important to use DLP to maybe actually manage permissions of what user has access to which files. So in case that one user doesn't have admin privileges but has that map shared drive and that somebody could steal, I think DLP is much more valuable for that. I've seen a handful of DLP solutions that are used to be able to lock down like execution applications. No offense, like me as an attacker, I'm using legitimate third-party or even built-in Windows applications, living off the land, kind of only using those as the modern attack right now. So yeah, there's probably some argument. I don't see it as an immediate moving the needle for me. I think there's probably 10,000 simpler things people should focus on before getting to these really crazy, for instance, on your Windows 7 machines, we're like less than a year before these things stop getting updates.
We have a lot of Windows 7 machines.
We have 100,000 plus computers in Huntress alone running Windows 7. You've got bigger fish to fry than your DLP solution.
And to be fair, we understand, right? Like a lot of MSPs are probably going to their customers and saying, hey, you need to update these Windows 7 machines. And I'm sure the pushback from the customer is, well, they work fine. What's wrong with them? But when you don't get updates anymore, that's not a good place to be in.
Yeah, even better, that POS machine, the medical machine. I don't mean piece of crap. I mean, I'm talking about the point of sale machines.
Yeah.
You might not even be able to update that thing from Windows 7 embedded. So there's all kinds of debt, right? There's only so far, though, we understand that you can educate customers. This is going to be the reckoning. We're seeing it happen right now to MSPs. Some of the lack of two-factor becoming a reckoning. So make sure in that case that you take that really serious there. But there's only so much you can do. Let's be real. We're 100,000 plus endpoints in Huntress still running Windows 7.
Hey, Kyle, one last question that I flagged for you there that I think we skipped over, and then I'll stop taking questions.
The one on VLAN segmentation?
Yeah.
So someone is saying, hey, how often do you actually see like port isolation used? I heavily use it for my customers to minimize impact, to restore from storms. But less likely, are less of a reality and one person gets infected, VLAN segmentation. We were at Cisco's Talos Threat Researcher Summit about a year ago.
Last summer, yeah.
And the number one thing Cisco came out, and keep in mind, they see all this stuff from lateral movement because they're seeing it from the appliance, right? Next-gen firewalls, routers. And the number one thing their threat researchers begged for on stage, John?
VLAN segmentation or network segmentation.
Between individual users or just
departments,
subgroups?
Even things that aren't as strict as VLANs. We've seen people that say, why do you need to have SMB open on your client machines? Maybe you only allow SMB to go back and forth from workstations to servers. That way they can access file shares. But obvious things like why is SMB allowed out? I still see it all the time. Segment obviously with VLANs internally works both ways with just, more of a soft SMB could be your firewalls, putting the firewalls up on the machines. But even the legit, what they were talking about at Cisco was, please put these on VLANs. We see this happen all the time at we have a very large food producer that one of our MSP supports. And they had in their network There's no reason that the IT machines needed to be able to access the OT or other technology that were running like the food curing and sous vide type capabilities. Right. So there's no reason that that needed to happen. Segment those networks. So in case everything goes down, it's not the OT, which is actually, that's not a technical problem. This is an operational business problem. When stuff hits the fan, how do you keep the food manufacturing running or the dry cleaner machines going, or the till, right? How do you keep the till away from finance, who's going to open every account payable invoice ever sent?
There's some cases where you can do this really easily. There's a lot of Wi-Fi vendors who support the ability for you to restrict different clients from communicating with each other. You'll see this a lot, like if you go to like a internet cafe type place or like a coffee shop or something, even though you and the person sitting next to you are on the same Wi-Fi, you're in the same subnet, you cannot reach their their computer, things like that. So sometimes you can get that. It's not VLAN segmentation, but sometimes you can get that for free. If all your customers are already on Wi-Fi that supports that type of stuff.
All right, guys. I think hour and a half is the longest I've ever seen. We're now beyond an hour and a half. I've got to thank everybody. You don't have several hundred people show up for a webinar to hear this stuff if it wasn't important. Yeah. My call to action and motivation, right? If you enjoy hearing us and our ugly faces, you're more than welcome to join our webinar with Duo. Huge fan of the product. We're obviously going to be talking about more than just Duo, though. It's going to be all kinds of how-to factors used and abused. So feel free to join that one. We've got a product that does detection and response. Cool, great. There's all kinds of great other products out there. Feel free to take a look at that. And most importantly, if you see these type of incidents, our support queue is open. We're still only one vendor. We're not the largest. We're far from the smallest. But let us know if you're seeing some of these breaking things. Hopefully some sort of community stands up. We would love to see vendors other than us sharing the threat intel. So that's our calling them out, putting them on blast. Feel free to make that phone call to your vendor du jour and say, hey, what is vendor X doing doing to share threat intel? I think it's needed. Even if they're just writing cool technical blogs, that is needed in this community because we are a channel. We're all in this together, both to make money, keep clients up and running, and essentially protect small and medium-sized businesses. So let's band behind it. Was that an okay call to action, guys?
Yeah. I mean, Huntress has a free trial, so go set it up, run it, and we'll tell you what we find. There's no reason you shouldn't give it a go.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, everybody. It was great hanging with you all. Please write back to marketing. Put your comments in here. We'll release a video of this, by the way. And yeah, let marketing know what you liked about this webinar, what you didn't like, because we're always trying to get better ourselves. All right, thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay protected. I hope this threat breach breakdown was beneficial.
Thanks.